Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar called Introducing Robots onto Sidewalks and Public Spaces, Challenges and Opportunities, with our guest speaker, Professor Peter Jones from University College London and the Centre for Transport Studies. I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker today and also our Executive Director, Bern Grush, and a little bit of information about them. So Peter is a Professor of Transport and Sustainable Development at the Faculty of Engineering Sciences. He has an incredible resume. I'm so excited to have him here as our guest today. Peter is a global subject matter expert, and we're delighted to have him as a member of the Urban Robotics Foundation. His talk will focus on the challenges and opportunities of introducing public area mobile robots, or PMRs, onto streets, sidewalks, and other public spaces. Among his work responsibilities, Professor Jones is a member of the City of London Transport Strategy Board and the Dubai Council for Future Transportation, and formerly the Southeast Wales Transport Commission, the Hong Kong ERP Advisory Panel, and the CIHT Urban Design Panel. He also plays a leading role in 2 Economic and Social Research Council projects in the UK on sustainable urban mobility, transitions on Africa, and governance issues around the introduction of automated vehicles in the UK. He advises the European Commission and a number of major cities and national governments around the world, and was awarded an Order of the British Empire for services to national transport policy. So excited to have him here. And I also obviously am excited to have our Executive Director, Bern Grush, who is an author, speaker, and thought leader in his own right, with over 20 years of standards writing, parking, road pricing, and autonomous vehicles. He's the global lead for an international standard, ISO 4448, and has a BSc in Human Factor Psychology and an MSc in Systems Design Engineering. So with those introductions out of the way, I will let you know that I'm going to just speak for a few more minutes about the Urban Robotics Foundation and public area mobile robots, and then I will hand it over to our guest speaker, and then Bern will be moderating the Q&A. Please use the chat to type in any questions that you have for our guests, and then if time permits, at the very end, I have a few more comments about municipal readiness, but I have a sense that we're going to keep talking through to the end of our hour. So the Urban Robotics Foundation was founded just 2 short years ago. We are working at the intersection of urban space, accessibility, and mobile robots. I mentioned the draft ISO, it's a new global standard for public area mobile robots, will be published actually starting in 2024. We have some of the parts already submitted. We're also writing and publishing municipal readiness guidebooks, 3 publications. 2 of them will be ready in January. We deliver workshops and we provide advisory services, and we are a global nonprofit and we are member supported. So what are public area mobile robots? So our work focuses on just the public area mobile robots. Peter obviously brings a much broader perspective, which we'll be happy to explore. But public area mobile robots are ground-based, so wheels, legs, tracks. They can have 2 or 4 legs, as you can see in some of the diagrams or photographs here. They're unmanned. The key thing is that they are used in public spaces around bystanders or pedestrians. So they can be on any kind of walkway, bikeway, public buildings, and they also will be performing tasks that basically are unlimited right now. We have new use cases showing up every day. So we're excited to be able to explore this whole area and help to nurture the industry as it evolves. What is not a PMR? So it's important to realize that our work at the Urban Robotics Foundation is not related to industrial or manufacturing robots, to those that are used in warehouses or factories, on farms, or in agriculture. We also don't deal with aerial drones or e-scooters or e-bikes. However, the learning and the work that we do can certainly be leveraged, and sort of there are some principles that are of benefit by understanding the work that we do. So the key challenges related to mobile robots are really related to the unstructured environment in which they operate. So here's an example from a sidewalk in Pittsburgh that was part of a pilot study that was published by Knight Foundation. We also have challenges around failures of the devices, and failure is part of the development of any industry. So it's not sort of the end of the road, but it really is that we need to understand, as those failures happen, how do we ensure that people are not made worse off? So here's an example of, it's actually some screenshots from a video that was taken by one of our researchers of a robot that's crossing a street. It fails, another robot comes along to help it along, and then a pedestrian, like a bystander, just tries to help. He pulls it back onto the sidewalk, and another pedestrian comes to help. But then what they do is they leave those robots in the accessibility space. So if you were in a wheelchair or had a child with a stroller, you would have difficulty getting up onto the sidewalk. So that's a key example. And then here, an employee from the company, these robots are teleoperated, an employee from the company actually comes to take away the one that is disabled. The robot that was still in working order goes to proceed across the street, and then what it faces is actually a driver error. So this driver pulls into the intersection, even though there's a green light. The robot is there, and then there's a car that comes to turn behind the robot. So the robot is kind of trapped in this situation. And what it does is it goes out into the main thoroughfare, and it's, potentially a very dangerous situation. It's not clear that the driver of this car actually knows that the robot is there. And, that yes, there's a little flag here, but are there, best practices or standards and ways that we could help flag this and then obviously, account for some of the human errors that are natural in our society. Another opportunity for robots is for people who have accessibility issues. So this woman is experiencing a condition called kyphosis, and the questions that some people have would be like, will a PMR alarm her because she can only see straight down in front of her? Will it block her path? So those are some of the challenges, but then are the opportunities. Could a PMR deliver groceries to her? Could it actually carry her bags in a follow me kind of format? Or could maybe even protect her and follow her. So opportunities and challenges, and that's sort of a good segue into what our guest speaker is going to be talking about today. A final slide before we hand it over to Peter, to really just make sure that all the people attending today understand that with the Urban Robotics Foundation, our goals are really to strengthen stakeholder readiness and to prepare urban ecosystems for robots, so that we can have, through well-constructed standards and consistent governance, we can support it in the industry growing through standards-based design and deliver greater accessibility and safety, higher acceptance, and better livability in our cities. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to now stop sharing my screen and ask Peter to please share his screen as we move into his presentation. Thank you so much, Peter.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lee, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the session today. My basic perspective really is from the point of view of cities. I think cities have not really recognized the significance of this new development. A lot of work has gone into worrying about autonomous cars and how you might design for those. But I think in many ways, the challenges are much greater for these PMRs and how they might affect the footways, sidewalks. So that's something I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about today. These various types of PMR are rapidly developing, and I would say in some parts of urban areas, I'd like to have a major impact on street design, street life within a few years, and particularly on lightly regulated footways. And as I said just now, many city authorities have not yet recognized the likely nature and extent of these impacts, and I think they need a wake-up call. These new various types of robots will challenge cities and will need careful integration into the street fabric. But as Lee said, they will potentially offer better, more efficient services, and also provide an opportunity to take a fresh look at how footways and sidewalks actually operate. You've already seen a similar photograph from Lee, just making the point that there are a variety of potential users, not just last mile deliveries, but also snow clearance, street cleaning, and other forms of support and so on. And of course, there are a whole range of environments in which these might operate. This is a very benign environment where essentially it's primarily a pedestrianized area, very wide, so very little conflict at all with pedestrians in the area. But in somewhere like the UK or Western Europe, this would be a more typical situation on the left in a residential area where you have relatively narrow footways, cars parked most of the way along there. And on the right-hand side, maybe a modern development, which is more pedestrian focused, but nevertheless will have cars and delivery vehicles going through there. And then, of course, when we get onto district centres and so on, here would be a local district shopping centre, a range of shops, restaurants and so on. And this is an example of the sort of things, and I'll come back to this, the sort of things that people are doing there. They're going there to shop, some are driving through, crossing the road, going there to a bank, strolling, living, running a business, all sorts of things going on there that these PMRs will need to fit into that environment. And then, of course, we can get to much more challenging situations. This is one of the main roads coming into central London from South London that has a very intense bus network and also interchange with one of our underground lines. And you can see there's lots of things going on the footway there, not in a very structured way. An example from work that Lee and Byrne have done, actually sort of illustrating what that might look like in a North American context, where you've got a lot of intensive activity, relatively small vehicles, and how do they fit into that environment. So I see from a sort of city point of view, really three main challenges. First of all, how to accommodate PMRs on footways, sidewalks, among a wide range of pedestrian movement and street activities. Just how do you their movement fit in with other movement and people doing things on streets. Secondly, the physical design of the footway, sidewalk, and carriageway crossing facilities. What type of facilities are needed to physically enable them to be able to operate in those environments? And then thirdly, building on the different components of the street network, will we end up designating preferred or possible or prohibited routes? And this has already been an issue for a number of years now, where local authorities, certainly within Europe, want to minimize traffic going through residential areas, whereas sat-nav systems actually often, by offering the fastest route, actually encourage cars to go through residential areas. And there's quite a tension there, and there's equivalent potential whether PMRs will also produce those challenges in cities. So taking the first of these, existing pedestrian movements, street activities. At the moment, if you take footways, sidewalks, then you look at what happens there. Pedestrian movement and street activities are generally unregulated, except where you've got very dense pedestrian movements, and then crowd control becomes important. Now, PMRs will need to be regulated to some degree, particularly if they become autonomous in terms of the paths they take along the footway, where and how they wait to cross pedestrian or potentially cycle crossings. Now, if you're going to start defining paths for the automated PMRs, then implicitly you're also saying something about what that means for pedestrians on the footway as well. And so I think there's a real issue for cities here that if the algorithms that are used to define paths for PMRs to use on footways and cross the road are determined by the operators and the developers, implicitly that will in effect determine what spaces are available for pedestrians. So the question is, should the cities actually be taking the lead and deciding how to slightly formalize the use of footways and sidewalks, or should it be left to PMR operators and the technical regulators? The other important thing to bear in mind around is, as I say, not just movement, but our busiest streets are destinations in their own right. And they attract a whole range of street activities on the sidewalks. Some more formal, like market stores and so on, but most informal, people just having a rest or chatting to friends or something. And these can occur almost over the entire footway between the edge of the curb line and the back of the footway next to the buildings. And they might not leave a clear path for PMRs. So again, will there need to be designated areas where people congregate to keep those clear paths? And on top of that, many what we call street activities require what we call street furniture. So for example, we may have benches on the street there so people can rest easily, or we may provide trees partly to provide shade and so on. And not only does this street furniture take up space, which obviously is not available for movement, but also they have their own footprint, as I'll demonstrate in a minute. So as PMRs are not as likely to be as agile as pedestrians, again, will this place extra restrictions on where street furniture can be placed and how these different elements on the street are laid out? So street activities, I've just taken a few random examples here. Obviously, top left, market stalls on the street. Bottom right, just some kids going along chatting, stopping now and then, looking in shop windows and so on. It might be bottom left, just a couple of guys standing outside the shop watching the world go by. Or it might well be that on the bottom right here, one of the cheaper clothing stores in the UK, where it looks as though the mothers decided to go in to do the shopping and left the fathers and children outside. But again, taking up space. And you can see here, for example, on the right-hand side, that the bench takes a certain amount of space, but with people standing around there, they need a lot more space. And the cycle racks on the front there don't look as though they take up much space when they're empty, but when they're occupied, they take up probably 3 times the amount of space. And street activities can be all over the place. So here's an example from central London, Covent Garden, where one of our MSc students looked at the types of activities that people do, street activities, whether it's just reading or playing around on the mobile phone, whatever, and how many people tend to be doing that and where they tend to be doing it on the street. And as you can say, it's almost all over the street. At the moment, there's no real regulation for that. And obviously, clearly, again, with loading, there are issues about the curbside is a very busy area. At some point, the PMRs will presumably come off a van or something. So the question is where there's going to be space to do that in environments that are very, very crowded. And in fact, if you look at what happens in our streets, then on the footway, then there are a whole range of things going on there. There are a series of services provided that really relate to the street as a place or destination, where there will be, as we said, retail market stores, less so now, but newspaper sellers, communications, post boxes, internet things, cash point machines, public transport stop, shelter seating, toilets, waste bins, seating, public art, greenery. And then there are also things that are not so much associated with street activity, but with movement, but nevertheless are part of the footway, the street furniture. So signposts, route information, tactile paving for people with low vision, CCTV, lighting columns, and so on. And also we tend to have a regulation, at least in the UK, that any piece of street furniture has to be set back from the edge of the curb between 450 and 550 millimeters, because large vehicles passing close to the curb, their wing mirrors will stick out and otherwise would knock into lampposts and things like that. So all these things, all these different features on the street, also not just taking their own space, but quite often taking up extra space. So if you have a bus shelter here at the top there, then quite often people will stand behind the bus shelter or next to the bus shelter, and down to simply bins. If you have a waste bin or trash bin, then quite often we find people start leaving other rubbish around there, bags of rubbish and so on. So it's not simply a question of how much space is taken up by these elements on the street, but how much space, when they're used, how much extra space is actually taken up. And as I was saying just now, pedestrians are fairly maneuverable on the whole, but with PMRs, maybe the maneuverability will be less, and maybe this will need to be taken into account. And here's an example from one of my MSc students, looked at central London. I won't go through it all. So, for example, the cycle stand I showed you just now just takes up about 0.1 of a meter by 0.6. But in fact, when you've got a bike there, it's 0.6 of a meter by about 1.3. And the same with benches. When you've got people sitting there with shopping, etc., it needs a lot more space. So, as I say, I think if we're going to think, how do we have clear paths for PMRs? A lot more thought will need to go into this, I think, in the future. The other point I want to make, and you won't be able to read the details of these photographs, but it's basically to say that the same street can look very different at different times of day and night. Obviously, at particular peak hours, there'll be a lot of people maybe going from transit stops and things like that, metro stations. In the evening, there'll be people, particularly in summer, outside having a drink and so on. So even the same physical piece of infrastructure is used very differently at different times of day. And again, that's a different environment in which PMRs will be operating at different times of day. And that leads on a bit more specifically to physical design requirements. And here there are a lot of things that need to take into account. Two primary dimensions. One is to do with the physical dimensions and slopes of footways and crossings. What are the minimum widths we need? Clearly, if we're going to have PMRs and they're not going to be in exactly the same path as pedestrians, then potentially the minimum widths might need to increase, at least on key corridors. And also we need to provide for street activity as well. A point that Lee made about queuing space at crossings, and also what's the maximum crossfall. That's the angle from on the footway from the curbside to the building line, which needs to be there to some extent so that rainwater drains off, and also the maximum maximum slopes as well that vehicles might go up. And then, of course, there's the whole thing about the quality of the services themselves and the quality of the drainage. How even are the surfaces? How good is the grip? And as I said, how we deal with drainage. And here, it might be that PMRs actually will help to improve conditions for mobility impaired groups, particularly people in wheelchairs or people with buggies and things as well, if they're happy to mix. Because for decades, many of our sidewalks, footways are not really very well designed for buggies or for wheelchairs, but maybe the extra pressure and the commercial pressure for actually making it possible for PMRs might actually mean that conditions improve for other groups that need high quality services as well. This is an example. At UCL for a number of years, we've been doing some quite detailed work looking, among other things, at how people maneuver on different surfaces. And on the left-hand side, here's an example of a whole series of experiments done with people on wheelchairs, looking at how maneuverable they are, coming off buses, for example, and trying to turn around, or on slopes, what sort of slopes can they deal with, and so on. And we had a fairly small facility for a number of years, but a couple of years ago, UCL's introduced literally, I think, a unique facility in the world called Pearl, Pedestrian Environment Activity Research Laboratory, which is essentially a large warehouse, 40 meters by 100 meters. You can see part of it there inside, where you can recreate any physical environment at more or less any scale. And next year, they're planning to recreate 100 meters of high street, so they can test all sorts of things. So there would be possibilities to use facilities like that to actually test tolerances and perhaps come up with design standards for particular cities or countries to actually specify the requirements of PMR capabilities. And also another aspect on that, they've just finished a series of trials there with one of the major e-scooter providers in the UK, actually trying out different noises to see what sort of noise would be useful on crowded footways to warn people that people are coming on e-scooters without being too intrusive, but standing out from the other background noises. And that's something that the company is now incorporating. So these are real challenges, but I'm saying there are facilities around the world, and UCL has some of those where these things could be tested so that we can be fairly confident how people, and obviously here you could recreate a street with lots of people walking there and PMRs trying to navigate among them. And that leads on to the whole question really of routing of PMRs over a network. Do we assume they'll be able to use every single street and every single sidewalk, every crossing, or will that not be possible? And that really raises the question about whether there'll be a need to carry out an audit. The example that Lee showed of a PMR being stuck, we don't really want that to happen very often. So maybe it'll be necessary for cities actually to carry out an audit to actually look at which streets are suitable for PMRs, and maybe different standards for different types of PMRs. And the next few slides, well, so let me just go on to this. So essentially, you might end up with restricted routing for two reasons. One is the physical one that I mentioned just now, that they're inaccessible, they're too narrow, too steep, or whatever. But also there may be other sections where it's seen that although physically you could accommodate PMRs, they would be seen as sensitive and wouldn't want them there. So for example, you might say outside schools where children are leaving the site at start and end of the day, you might want not PMRs going through that area at that time to avoid clashes with school children. And as I said just now, probably it would be necessary to carry out street audits. There's a lot of previous experience we can draw on, not just the work I showed you in Pearl, looking specifically at the maneuvering capabilities and so on of wheelchairs or PMRs and other mobility restricted groups, but also how you might go about creating audits. And the next few slides, some we produced a few years ago as a concept. So this is a sort of mainly a residential, typical high density residential area in an inner city, where you look at that network and then you divide it into sections and a separate section for each side of the road. You can see there with the blue line links, and then the junctions. And it's a question of looking at each of those elements to see their capability and suitability. So here, for example, here's a link, a section between two junctions of footway. And on the footway, there are a number of things that we can look at to do with the width, slopes, surface conditions, etc. But also we want to know how that interacts with the frontage. In other words, how that interacts with the building itself. So if you have a PMR, can it then access into the building? What does it mean in relation to the curbside? And then we're also looking separately at the carriageway, where the vehicles move up and down, the crossings, and maybe there's special areas like bus or tram stop areas that, you know, where we have to allow for particular types of maneuvers going on there, and people waiting around and so on. And then we could break down, if we're looking at footway, that we could then not just look at the character of the footway itself, but also look at the things, the street furniture that actually might be on the footway. So lampposts, traffic signs, toilets, public art, etc. And then for each of those, potentially look at their characteristics in terms of the amount of space they take, and also their footprint, to see how much space they're taking up in total on the footway. And then having got that information, what you might do is to define two different groups. Now, we were thinking there of people in wheelchairs, for example, maybe manual wheelchairs, electric wheelchairs, or people with walking sticks and so on. But again, it might be that you have a different set of standards and capabilities for small PMRs and large PMRs, or something like that. And what you might do when you define the characteristics of the PMR, and you relate that to your audit to see what the street's capable of, you might, for example, see in this diagram here at the top there, on one side of the road is accessible all the way along, but the other one is either tricky in amber or just not passable in red. And then the pie charts there represent the capabilities or the usability of the different parts of the footway there. Sorry, part of the crossings at the junction. And here might be a different one where you might have much tighter restrictions because of less capability of the PMR or wheelchair, whatever it is. And there you might find actually that there are no contiguous routes through that particular area for that type of vehicle or that type of person. So we came up with a sort of concept and done a bit of work in that area. But to give you a very specific example from one of my MSc students recently who worked with the City of London, and this is a small area in the City of London, around the Barbican, which is an area where was developed in the 60s and 70s, and where some of the footways are actually elevated. But you see what the student did there effectively was look at each side of the road separately as a link, and each junction point as a footway node, and then looking at each of those separately in terms of what their characteristics are, width, smoothness, safety, a whole number of different things there. And you can see they actually spend a lot of time looking at each crossing, each component of each crossing, each footway on each side, and according to a set of criteria, measured the provision along each of those sections and each of those junctions. And then this is just to give you an idea. I'm not suggesting you really get into this, but this was something that the City of London had commissioned, a City of London sustainable accessibility study, where essentially they identified a whole range of people with different types of disability. You can see along the top there. So people in electric wheelchairs, manual wheelchairs, people with walking frames and things like that, and defined what their capabilities are, and then we're able to match off different street sections and different junctions to see for each of those different groups whether they would be able to cope with that situation or not. And again, PMRs are different, but there might be an analogy here that we could think about developing. And then again, you don't have to go into the details, but we took some examples of different places that people with different types of mobility restrictions might want to travel to and from in the City of London. We measured the most direct routes from A to B if you're an able-bodied person in terms of distance and time. And then for people who did have restricted mobility, a guide dog user or a person with a walking impairment, we could see that some of those junctions, crossings and sections wouldn't be accessible to them. So we can see that in these three examples here, on average, their distances are about 30% longer and the journey times about 30% longer than if they'd been able-bodied, because a number of those sections and crossings were not actually accessible to them. So just in conclusions, I think it's very likely that PMRs will appear on the streets of many cities within the next few years. My concern is that if cities don't take the initiative and decide on how they would like their footways to operate as places for pedestrian movement and also for street activities, then the imperative or need to develop rules for PMRs will indirectly define how footways are to be used by people. And this is a major challenge, but also an opportunity to improve the design quality and functionality of footways to the benefit of disability groups and other street users, and possibly partly funding the improvements, the auditing and the improvements through industry fees for having permits to use those streets in urban areas. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's wonderful. And I'm going to now ask Bern to unmute. Thank you so much. And
thanks, Lee. Peter, thank you so much for that. That was very thorough. And I learned some things. Even though I've been at this for several years, I still learned more. And I do have a couple questions I want to ask you of some of my favorite topics about your talk. And also, if there's anybody that does have questions, I'm going to interject those as well. But let me ask quickly. I just have a couple questions. So first of all, you observed very clearly that the footprint surrounding street furniture is more expansive than the objects themselves. They take up more navigational space than one might expect, especially when they're occupied and full. So my question is, how optimistic are you that we can make way for robots in our densest areas, specifically some of the downtown places that are very busy at certain times of the day? Do you think we can? Do you think planners can devise a formula for cities to determine when and where robots are suitable? You're such a planner yourself. Do you think you can describe that in a way cities can take that information and make decisions? Will that be easy for cities to do?
It's something that most of them haven't thought about, but that's the point I'm trying to make. I think we need to be thinking about these things now rather than being caught out. I mean, many cities got caught out by e-scooters because they didn't think about them beforehand. I think the thing is to avoid that with PMRs so that cities are ready and they can collaborate with the developers and operators. I think that's probably quite important. I mean, there's two sides to this, isn't it? One is what the requirements are of the PMR, and there may be issues there about what the maximum size might be. And this is something that we don't generally give a lot of consideration to. So, for example, with cargo bikes, certainly in the UK, there's no restriction on maximum width, and yet we're defining widths for cycle lanes without defining comparable widths for cargo bikes. In Belgium, they have a maximum width of a meter, and then they design their cycle lanes for that. So I think probably, I know the standards recognize the need for that and leave it to individual cities or countries. But I think that's something that we ought to try and agree on fairly soon. What are the maximum dimensions that we're trying to accommodate, and also what sort of levels of maneuverability? So that will help us to consider that. Clearly, at very busy peak times, in places like London, you've got people pouring out of tube stations, and there's literally no space, and that's really not going to work for anybody. And I think people in wheelchairs avoid the streets at that time. But as I indicated, the same street is very different at different times of day. And just as, for example, we only allow, maybe in busy streets like Oxford Street, we only allow loading before 9 or 10 in the morning and after 6 or 7 at night. Maybe we'd have to do the equivalent to that. So I think on the one hand, it's three things really. It's a question of what are the physical characteristics and maneuverability of PMRs that we're designing for. What's the density of activity on the footway in terms of pedestrian movement, street activity? Is there any space? And then looking at time as an opportunity to actually make maximum value of PMRs when there is effectively spare capacity on the streets.
Perfect. Makes total sense. Thank you. So you also observed that if we improve pavement and sidewalk, the slopes and the surfaces and various qualities about the pavement or sidewalk, such that they're more suitable to PMRs, this would also improve conditions for the mobility impaired. Sure. So the question I have is, do you think disability groups should take a stand against PMRs, as has happened in my city of Toronto, or should they use PMRs to agitate for better active transport infrastructure to be shared by all of us? In other words, after all, these devices can provide important services to the mobility disadvantaged. You saw the image that Lee showed earlier of a woman that could have been assisted considerably. So there would be a double advantage for collaboration, not only better infrastructure, but better services. So what would your advice to the disability community be?
My advice would be to engage now at this stage before they become a major feature, when there's still an opportunity to actually influence the regulation and the way they're accommodated on streets. yes, just reiterating what you're saying, I think there will be pressure to improve footway services and to improve crossings, etc. And that can work to the advantage of people in wheelchairs, families with buggies with young kids and so on. But I think the thing is to come at that now and actually say, are there ways that we can accommodate that? It might well be that in denser areas, you restrict the maximum speed of a PMR to the same speed as a wheelchair user or something, and maybe ways to do this. But I think the thing is to have the discussion now where there's still a chance to influence the design and operation of PMRs and the ways in which their design is taken into account on footways and sidewalks. Yeah.
Thank you. So part of one of the last things you said, you in the sense that there's a major opportunity to improve our footways to the benefit of all of us, that this could be partly funded through industry fees, was one of the points you made at the end. So, realistically, most footways in most places experience a tremendous functional deficit already. I mean, our pedestrian ways are generally not treated as well as many of our roadways in many cities. So, in other words, public area mobile robots are arriving at a time when the urban pedestrian, especially the mobility challenged pedestrian, is already at a disadvantage even before they arrive. So it's not so. But I think it's not going to be commercially viable to have PMR systems carry the full burden of bringing these footways to better conditions. So my question is, do you have any sense of what would be a reasonable portion of that burden for these PMRs to carry? I understand I know that's a hard question. There's not an easy answer to that, but I'd love to hear what your advice to cities might be about how they would engage in that in setting such fees.
Well, I think the starting point would be to work with PMRs to actually audit the streets and see what's there, because in many places we don't have that at the moment. And the thing I showed you from our student in the City of London, they hadn't carried out such a detailed audit themselves in the city, even though they've now got this tool to identify the requirements of different disability groups. And I think that might be a starting point where there's a collaboration, including some financial contribution from PMRs. And in fact, I mean, some of those could potentially do the audit themselves with the cameras and things. I mean, maybe ways we can use that technology to speed up and make the audit a more efficient process. I mean, after that, there is a growing trend, I think, for charging, not pedestrians, but for charging, or cyclists, but charging for use of cities. Obviously, for a very long time, it's been quite common to charge for parking at the curbside. Now, increasingly, we're talking more generally about monetizing the curb and charging people for loading at the curbside with the incentive of having guaranteed loading space. I know there's been some talk about whether Uber should be charged 50 cents or something for dropping off and picking up as well. So, and obviously we have congestion charging and road pricing in some places. So I think there is a growing trend to introduce pricing, partly as a way of regulating demand, but also as a way of actually helping to fund some of these things, maintenance and so on. And I guess, in a UK environment anyway, the argument would be, well, let companies bid and see how much they bid to have the rights to be able to operate on our football.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, no, I like that. It's kind of like bidding for slots at the airport.
Yeah,
so, yeah, very similar. So thank you for those three answers. We do have 3 questions so far. Anybody else has any questions, type them in. I'm just going to take them in order, fairness to the people that typed them in. This is from one of our attendees today, Adam. The question is to you, Peter, of course, to you, Peter, is there any burning bridge that you are seeing in the UK come to light that might be spurring city action on PMRs?
At the moment, the issue is that they're not actually legal in the UK, and where there have been demonstration examples, they've actually had derogation from the regulations. So we would need to have a general regulation in the UK to enable these things to operate on footways, particularly autonomously. And in some ways, as a result of that, cities are stepping back saying, well, it's not a problem because they're not regulated. So I think the problem in a sense is the burning bridge in the sense that they're not regulated, they're not allowed. But because of that, my worry is that cities are stepping back. And I've talked to Transport for London particularly about this. And their argument is, well, it's not down to us, it'll be down to the Department of Transport to regulate them. But that's not my point really. The point is it's the cities that know how they'll actually operate on their own environments, and they should be the ones that are taking the lead in deciding that. So possibly there's an issue of complacency because they're waiting for a national government response, and maybe that's true in other other countries as well. Whereas I think people ought to be there ahead of the game. And I think the argument I use with cities is, well, look what happened with e-scooters. You waited till they appeared, and you've all had big problems. Let's try and avoid that problem in the case of PMRs.
Exactly.
Vern, before you go to the next question, I just wanted to add a follow-up. So there is apparently an automated vehicles bill in the UK now, and I'm just wondering if you're seeing any kind of acceleration in discussions around AVs that could sort of be simplified if cities were preparing themselves for PMRs as well. So I'm trying to figure out, sort of there's so much investment and attention on AVs right now. And I just wonder if that could be the burning bridge in terms of PMR adoption and deployment, especially around intersections. And
yeah, well, yes. And I mentioned very briefly earlier that 99% of the attention is on autonomous motorized vehicles on the carriageway. Very little discussion at all about autonomy on the footway. And I have talked to one or two people at DFT, but the political focus is very much on the autonomous motor vehicle, not least because Britain or our British government wants Britain to be a leading manufacturer and of the hardware and software, etc. So that's where all the focus has gone. But yeah, I think that ought to be considered alongside. And as you say, you then get to the issue about the interaction between autonomous motor vehicles and autonomous mobile robots, and that needs to be thought through as well, which I don't think it has at the moment, to be honest. But it's a very important point.
Yeah, no, agree completely. The same thing happens in here in Canada, especially in the province of Ontario. The interest in being the first in the automotive section takes any attention away from these. And we think that there's an enormous opportunity to learn about autonomy and about managing autonomous vehicles, about teleoperation, all those sorts of things. They're not the same as, but there's a lot of similarities, and we could learn in a much lower, lower risk environment if we paid more attention to these.
And I think more so than the people working on the regulations realize, because one of my concerns about autonomous vehicles is if you go back 50 or 60 years in many many European cities and some of the West East Coast American cities, at that time there was a focus on actually separating pedestrians. And in the UK particularly, we had lots of guard railings, so pedestrians were not able to cross the road where they wanted to. They had to go to particular crossing points and so on. And over the last 20 or 30 years, we've taken out, in London, they've taken out several hundred kilometers of guard railing. And the view now is we're having lower traffic speeds, often 20 miles an hour. And we're, pedestrians should be free to cross at informal crossings, and we shouldn't have this, this us and them. It should be more shared space.
Yeah.
Now, what I think will happen is when autonomous vehicles come along, then when pedestrians and cyclists know they can step in front of the vehicle, it will stop. Then people will be cutting across the whole time. That will delay the traffic quite badly. There'll be a big backlash to that and saying we have to have pedestrian guard railing back, etc. So I think the issue about mixing,
1902 again.
yeah. So I think the issue about mixing is not really considered when it comes to autonomous vehicles, but I think it will turn out to be a big issue, mixing with pedestrians and cycles, and there should be more consideration to that as well.
I want to, Alana Coombs is with us, and I know, Peter, Alana, and Alana was with Transport for London, was with the London City a while ago during the very early days of testing these. Alana, you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah, I was with the City of London. Yeah, there's a few things that occur to me. Interestingly, I'm actually in Santa Monica at the moment, and we've got a autonomous vehicle trial here. And you, Peter, you just mentioned this about autonomous vehicles giving way to other street users. And I've joined the trial, and I've got a week's worth of free Waymo rides. And one of them I noticed is that on one of my journeys, a car came out from a side road and wanted to get into the travel lane, and the autonomous vehicle braked suddenly to let this, and it was like, whoa, and let this car out. And the car actually wasn't being particularly aggressive in trying to do so, but it still responded. And it's really interesting what you say, because I think there's definitely a kind of problem coming down the track there for PMRs as well. My question, and I think perhaps this might preempt a little bit what Bhavisha is going to say as well, and it's around adapting to changes in priorities on the sidewalk. So I'm kind of thinking we may do all this work as a local authority, as a city council, we might do all this work to measure things and get things in place, but things change and the use of the other calls on the sidewalk come into play. So I'm thinking, I gave the example, for instance, say the city council does something where they want to promote healthy living, you get more people exercising, you get people out on the road running, and that changes what the demands are of that stretch of sidewalk. So there's an element of sort of how do we respond to those changes, and can we do it quickly, or how quickly can we do it? But also all of this comes at a cost. And if actually you're talking about little robots delivering pizza, is it really fair that taxpayers are paying for this? Who should bear the cost I suppose is what my question is.
Yeah, well, on that last, going back to my previous point, I think a typical UK government approach would be, let's put out licenses and people can bid for them effectively if they want to, and see if there's a market that's worth doing that. As you were talking, I was just thinking about unusual situations, and of course in somewhere like London, at certain times you get police horses going by, and I wonder how both an AV and a PMR would react to a police horse going by. Probably won't have been trained on that very much in terms of the AI preparation. I think streets are very dynamic, particularly footways are very dynamic. And because at the moment there aren't any rules really, but most of the time we're talking about people on foot, with a few people on scooters and skateboards and a few people in wheelchairs, it sort of works. But it may well be there are critical points, that I know Bern has given and Lee have given thought to this, that if on average you've got one PMR every 400 meters, it may not be an issue. If you've got one every 10 meters, it becomes totally different. And the nature of what you're dealing with becomes very different. And you can see this in shared space type streets where we have those that, when the vehicle flow is very low, 100 vehicles an hour or something, then essentially the pedestrians control the whole street and the vehicles maneuver around the pedestrians. Once you get up to several hundred vehicles an hour, then the dynamic completely changes. So I think that's an element we probably haven't thought about. Are there critical threshold points in terms of flow densities that might change the nature of how that operates? And maybe we wouldn't want them to go above that point. I mean, again, somewhere like Pearl could do some interesting experiments there to see, as you build up pedestrian flow or build up PMR flow, do you get to a point where the whole dynamic on the footway just flips? Is there a tipping point? I think that would be a really interesting question. Yeah.
So I have one more question here, and if anybody else has questions, please load them into the chat. This question from Bhavisha, and I read it to you, Peter. For municipalities looking to deploy PMRs or PMR companies designing or building the technology, who performs the street audits for PMR feasibility and use? The students performing these analyses have expertise, but do companies that are providing this service exist yet?
Well, I mean, there are companies that do street audits. I mean, a lot of local authorities. I mean, London, for example, TfL has done street audits. Lots of people have done street audits, either formerly local authorities or organisations like Living Street do more qualitative ones where they go out with people, particularly with disabilities, to see which are the crunch points or pinch points on streets and so on. So I think there are a number of consultants that would be able to do street audits. I think there are two issues. One is exactly what you define in the audit. And I gave you this hypothetical example of dividing intersections and whatever, and then the example from the City of London where we broke it down very finely. Now, of course, being an academic study, we can go to the gold standard. I guess the question is, what would you need to do? And clearly, in a sense, when you're looking at a street section or a footway section, you don't have to worry about the whole section. You just have to look at the pinch point, or the point where the surface is very bad, because you don't have to have a problem over 100 yards to have a problem. If you've got a really serious problem over a few yards, it can still block that particular street. So I think there would need to be a discussion, and I think this links nicely into the work you're doing, leading Bern and Lee, on the ISO standard. What are the elements that you think should be in the standard, and therefore how would that link to designing an audit that would be able to make sure, or to identify the streets and the crossings where those standards are being, well, of course, you're defining the nature of the standard, not the actual standard itself. But I think would then be a question of going on at national or city level, actually turning that into a number rather than just a category or an indicator, but an actual number, and then linking that back into the audit. But I think my point there was possibly that cities are very tight on resource and so on, and therefore maybe if there are major players coming in that want to operate PMRs, maybe they can fund or partly fund the actual carrying out of the audits. And I think they need to be done independently by consultants or local authorities and so on. But as I said, it may well be that in a number of cases, if there are trial runs being done of PMRs, they may be able to collect useful information. And been talking with our students to Mercedes-Benz, actually, as an example, and they now have very detailed information from their vehicles. We did a bit of work. They know if a vehicle suddenly brakes or swerves, that indicates a near miss for a collision. And they have that information down to 5 meters. And similarly, they were telling me now with their new radar, in principle, as they go down the street, they can see whether the curbside is empty or not, and they could let local authorities know in real time, whether there was spare space at the curbside if you wanted to dynamically allocate it for loading. So I think there are possibilities now with technologies that maybe a lot of the labor, heavy lifting of auditing, to some of that might be able to be taken away. But again, that's a question of collaboration, I think, between yourselves, PMR developers, and cities to see what standards they want to use and how you would actually audit it. So that, and I think the audit's very important, because clearly, companies wouldn't want to send their PMRs down streets where they're going to get stuck or damaged or something. So there's a common interest in understanding the standards and understanding, the network. And then we could, on the one hand, identify what we think the core routes are, at least for initial PMR services, and then how that relates to the quality of the footways and crossings at those points. Maybe having restrictions on PMR use at certain times of day. I think they've been actually taking, sections of towns or cities and actually working down with companies, with yourselves and others, and actually trying now and seeing what we can do would be really valuable.
Wonderful, Peter. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. And I just want to leave off with a reminder to everybody that we have some municipal guides to public area mobile robots coming up for release. So the executive guide and the discovery guide will be released in January. And if you go to our website, you can actually sign up to get your free copy of the executive guide and a discount on the upcoming discovery guide. And please follow us on LinkedIn if you aren't already a follower. And if you're interested in joining, I'm happy to address any membership questions that come up. Thank you again for participating. I see a couple of thanks in there, but no other questions. So we'll let you all go. And
if anybody wants to follow, up with me, I'm very happy to do so. I think I put my email address on the first slide, I think. Yeah. Thank you very much. Nice to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.